part of prophylactic play is identifying what your opponent may want to do, and then you prevent it. When this pawn went from c7 to c5, there should be something that your mind just sort of focuses on as like weak, like your like radar is just like you're honed in to a particular weakness that has been created because of the advancement of the pawn to c5 as opposed to c6, which is what most people would have played in that situation. So most people would play c6 here, not c5. Now c5, the glaring weakness is the square on d5. And white now set it up. White now set it in his mind that black has a way to fight for this square, and I am going to try to deter him from carrying out the fight for that square. So, if black wants to get rid of the weakness on d5, what move would black want to play? It's not black's move. I'm just asking because today's lecture is prophylactic play. And part of prophylactic play is identifying what your opponent may want to do, and then you prevent it, right? That's preventative measures. So d5, exactly. Black would like to play the move d5 because d5 would get rid of the weakness on d6, the sort of backwards pawn, if you will, and it would get rid of the strong square. I would at least fight for control of the strong square. So Szabo plays knight e4. And here, I think that black makes a positional mistake. Because in this position, black has committed to the move c5, not c6. And as a consequence of putting the pawn here and having this pawn on e5, the square on d5 can no longer be protected by a pawn. It's an outpost. And when your opponent has an outpost, if you have the luxury of getting rid of it, then you should certainly do it. And here, black could have played the move d5. And you'll notice in the games that I'm going to show you today, in most of the games, they had an opportunity to do what they were planning to do. They didn't, and then the other side just shut it down. This was black's chance to play d5, but he instead played the move knight f8. And I think that's positionally a mistake, because if you have the unique opportunity to get rid of your weakness and at the same time challenge the center, right? Because one of the bad parts of this pawn being back here on d6 is that it doesn't have a lot of influence. I mean, it guards these pawns, but you'd like for it to move forward and challenge the center. So I think that black should have played the move d5 to get rid of that structure weakness. And remember, structure weaknesses are long-term things. So if you have a chance to get rid of your structure weakness and challenge the center and all these other benefits, you should do that. But black played the move knight to f8. And now white is so persistent in an attempt to not allow the move d5. So white plays the move knight e to c3. And I like that move because it eyeballs this d5 square, but now that this knight is over here, the c5 square becomes weak as well if this pawn advances. So I don't actually know where this knight was going. I think based on the way that black followed up, I think he had the idea of putting the knight here, but it didn't end up working. So Like, black played bishop to h3 here, and that clears the e6 square. Maybe he thought he's getting it here, but remember that this square is not an outpost square. White can always play the move e3, so even though it's a strong square pinched by two of black's pawns, it is not an outpost square. So here, white didn't even allow the capture of this bishop. White played the move bishop to h1. And the reason for that is white still has quite a bit of pressure on the b-pawn, but also this bishop controls that d5 square. So the bishop went back to d7, and, you know, black is thinking, okay, what if I go here and I challenge that bishop's diagonal? But I'll note that black played knight to d7, bishop to h3, bishop back to d7, and so he's losing time. And once again, after the move c5, he gave up this d5 square. So white's like, I am never going to allow you to play d5. Like, your worst decision was not playing d5 when you had a chance. So white plays the move knight to b5, which I like a lot. And the purpose of this move, other than targeting the d-pawn, is the knight is thinking about possibly going into a7 if the bishop lands on c6. That's sort of what happens. So bishop c6 happened. Again, black is like trying to play the move d5. Now, let's talk a little bit about something, though. If we're trying to prevent d5, why are we so heavily trying to do it with our pieces? Why don't we want to play a move like pawn to e4? So let's see. Gives black a counter outpost, is what El Boss says. Not to create a weakness for ourselves, right? Exactly, Fisher. Right? You don't want to give yourself the same exact weakness. Dinecki says we want to have e3. Yeah, the greater pawn flexibility is an advantage. So again, if this knight tries to come to the strong square d4, you always can play the move pawn to e3, controlling your central squares. Black has forfeited the control over this square because of the pawns on c5 and e5. Okay, so, all right. After bishop to c6, knight a7 was played, which was actually one of the whole ideas of playing knight to b5. He foresaw the bishop coming here, so he went knight a7. This move forks the queen and the bishop, queen to d7, and white took the bishop with the knight. Now, that's sort of what white wanted to do. And white was saying, okay, you can cover the d5 square by taking with your pawn, if that's what you wish. But the downside of black taking with the pawn is what? And it's a pretty big downside, I should say. Like, the upside, if you take with the pawn, is that you control that weak d5 square. But there's an immense downside to capturing with the pawn here. What is it? Exactly. This pawn on b6 suddenly becomes a passed pawn. Yeah, so black took with the knight. Notice you cannot take with your queen because there's a bishop hiding back here. So, okay, well, white is absolutely sure he does not want black to play d5 ever. White's like, well, this knight is not the best piece anymore, so I'm going to bring it back to c3. Black is persistent. He wants to try to have some control over the d5 square, but white just trades it all off. He's like, I am going to play my pieces on this square, and I am not going to allow you to advance this pawn. And, you know, after like this trade, for example, it is really important to note that it's really white who has the majority of the play here. One, because this bishop is pretty nice. Right? You agree with that. Two, white has the bishop pair, which is actually important in this position because there are so many pawn breaks left to open the game that the bishops will be able to reign free as they wish, after moves like f5 or f4 rather, or e3 and d4 at the right moment. There's just pressure on this b pawn. So white has the positional advantage in a lot of ways. And black has no pawn flexibility. Like we talked about this. Like white can leave the pawn here. White can advance the pawn one square to challenge the center. White has this break as well if white wants that break. So small advantage for white, but a stable and persistent one. It's like a nagging advantage for black because black doesn't really have much to do. So rook e8 was played. Bishop to d2, getting the pieces ready. Rook to a6, targeting this pawn a little bit. And maybe black wants to play something like queen to d8 and attack it, but again, it can all be defended. So queen c1 was played by white, which gains a little tempo here on the pawn on h6, so black guarded that. And then white played the move bishop to c3. And again, white is just preparing the forces. White is not exactly sure what he wants to do yet, but we'll sort of see what happens. Personally, I think white's plan is pretty clear here. White is slowly trying to challenge the A file. Because what's the best that black can do on the A file? How many pieces? Realistically, how many pieces can black get to the A file? Yeah, exactly. BB Blocker says one more. So you're gonna be able to get your rooks to the A file. But white's saying, I can challenge this A file with pieces that can take control of a file more than you can. So what white is doing slowly is playing queen to b2 to guard the pawn on b6. Then rook to a1. And even if you're doubled up here, white wants to trade, bring this rook over, and eventually when black trades, white wants to be able to capture with the queen. And remember, the queen can seize the open file too. Black's queen can't do the same thing because black has to guard this pawn the whole time. So white carries that part out of this part of the game very well. So white plays queen b2, rook to a1. And again, white doesn't mind if everything trades because in the end, like for example here, white's queen is still a very active piece on the open file. And with clear points to attack and infiltrate to, that's a big deal for white. So that's all white is trying to do. Black can't really do anything. Black doesn't have a flexible structure. And for example, like rook a1 happened in the game, this knight, which looks like it can pop into this strong square on d4, again, white always at their disposal has the move pawn to e3 to either keep the knight out or kick the knight out once it gets there. And that's the difference between, black having played his pawns like this, giving that d5 square, and white having flexibility with his pawns like this, for example. To be able to go e3. Queen d8, targeting the pawn here. White traded. Black traded. White played rook to b1 because he wants to guard his pawn. And now black has to guard this again. So black was like, well, if you want to take this pawn, I'll take this pawn and I, fork you. So white just guarded the pawn and said, okay, well, I'm still attacking you. So go back to babysitting that pawn like I asked you to. So queen a8 happened. I like the move rook to a1, just challenging the file, because in the end, there's no real good way to guard that pawn. But queen to b5 was played, which I actually think is also a very strong move. And, because, well, where exactly does white want to go? White is infiltrating. White wants to play the move queen to d7, and if we can get into queen to d7, we would be attacking the b pawn. We would be attacking the pawn on f7. we would attack the pawn on d6, right? So allowing the move queen to d7 would be an absolute disaster for black. So black played queen c8. And white's control of the board here is very visible. And I believe what's beautiful about this position, we talked about making your not passed pawn, your deeply placed not passed pawn, a passed pawn. Remember that? Those of you who were here, we talked about that. It's, you have this pawn here that's very close to promotion, but it's not a passed pawn. It's deep in opponent's territory, but it's not a passed pawn. White has a very unique way to make this deeply placed, not passed pawn, a passed pawn. And that concept revolves around queen captures rook, pawn takes, and then the advancement of the b-pawn. Szabo played bishop takes knight, which is totally fine. The only move here is pawn takes. And you're like, no, I know how the pieces move. There's another move. I can play queen takes. Now the sacrifice is even easier to judge, because when you play here, honestly, it's not a sacrifice, because after you do this, there's no stopping the pawn. So after bishop takes e6, forces black to play pawn takes, where the idea is the queen can still blockade the pawn here. But I would like for you to evaluate right now whether or not you would do that or not. So would you play queen takes, rook, pawn takes, b7, queen to b8? Is that enough to win the game, or should you just play some other moves? Let's see what happens. Szabo plays queen takes a6. We get this, chess for you says no comment. I don't want to answer, please leave me alone. Okay, b7, queen b8 only move, because any other queen move allows the pawn to promote. Black would find themselves down a rook if they had to give away they had to give away their queen for a pawn. So the only logical move is to blockade. Now, there are a lot of ways that win the game here, but I still want us to think in a prophylactic way. Are you guys ready for that? Because this whole lecture was on prophylactic play. So even in this stage of the game, I really like what white did here. It's very human. It's quite beautiful, because it doesn't allow any play for the opponent. It does not allow the opponent to get any active play in the endgame, because Fischer's Ebb said that if we go directly here to here, black would thereby have to take, and we would promote. In the end position, black would have a bishop, we would have a rook. This pawn would be a goner, so that's not so important. But we have to try to figure out, in that situation, if we went here to here, they took, we pushed, they took, and essentially we would end up with a piece with our rook on b8. Could black defend that position? Honestly, I'm not sure. But if black could defend that position, it would involve them playing the move e4 and then getting the bishop into the game. So Szabo said there is no rush. As Tang said, Anu said, Dineki says, e4, crushing. I love the move e4. I think this is a complete beautifully done prophylactic move, which ensures that the rook versus bishop endgame is going to be winning. Here's why it ensures that. You ready? It ensures that that endgame is going to be winning because this bishop will never see the light of day, and these weak pawns will never be able to advance. And when they do, white will not react at all because white wants to keep this pawn fixed on that e5 square as to block the black bishop. So we're going to see how the game plays out. Black desperately played d5. White just went on with the plan. White said, listen, if you want to trade, by all means do that. These pawns are all falling to bits and pieces. There's no reason for white to trade because as long as that pawn stays there, the bishop on g7 never becomes an active piece. So we had a trade. Finally, this happened. And, okay, black tried to keep the queens on. This is surely 100% losing. Because all these pawns are, oh man, you do not want to have to guard. You do not want to have to try to guard those pawns. And rooks are better than bishops. So that's another good reason. So, black tried to keep the queen on the board, but it didn't help. So black tried to get active, but this is all for nothing. Yeah. Queens come off, and I mean, this is just a matter of rounding up the game. I really like just the total advancement on the e4 square. Just the poor bishop is just awesome. Okay. So here comes the rook to round up all the weaklings. And I love the transition here to the endgame, which is the following. The king is cut off. You guys see that. So the best thing that black is going to be able to do here is just move the king. Because you want the bishop to remain guarding this pawn. But the pawn is protecting the rook is cutting off the king. So the king can never gonna pass this file. What's white's winning plan? Black resigned here. Black resigned, but let's say black goes here. What is the winning plan for white? And which is the principal reason that black resigned. Exactly. All of you are correct. Bring the king around and then sacrifice the rook for the bishop and a pawn. And then your pawn's going to queen. Yeah. And then your pawn's going to queen. So like, for example, just to show you how that would look. Because again, if you move this bishop, you'd like to try to block. I'm always going to take that pawn if you move the bishop. So this is sort of inevitable. And then you cash in on your exchange. This is exactly why rooks are better than minor pieces. Just more flexibility, access to all the squares, stronger pieces. So in the end, the pawn just strolls home to promotion. Hi, I'm Peter Giannatos, founder of the Charlotte Chess Center. If you enjoyed these videos, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you'd like to watch these videos live, be sure to follow us on Twitch.